The vet's hand was steady when she lifted the syringe, but her eyes told a different story. Something had already happened in that room before the needle ever came close, something that would stay with every person present for the rest of their lives. But to understand it, you have to go back to where it all began, to a quiet stretch of rural land, and an animal that should never have been found the way it was. The call came in on an ordinary Tuesday morning. A landowner in a rural county had spotted something near the far edge of his property, low to the ground, half hidden in the brush, not moving the way a wild animal should move. He'd kept his distance at first. You don't approach a bobcat in the wild, you know better. But after 20 minutes of watching from the tree line, seeing no movement, no alertness, no reaction to sound, he made the call. Something was wrong, badly wrong. By the time the wildlife rescue team arrived, the bobcat had barely shifted position. It was an adult, a female by the look of her, and she was lying on her side in the tall, dry grass, her breathing visible only if you watched closely enough and long enough to catch the shallow rise and fall of her ribcage. Her coat, normally a dense and striking pattern of tawny brown and dark spots, was dull and matted. Her eyes were open, but only halfway. There was no recognition in them. No fear either, just an absence, the particular kind of stillness that speaks not of rest but of exhaustion so complete that the body has simply begun to let go. The team worked carefully. These were people who understood wild animals, understood that even a severely weakened bobcat could summon enough instinct to bite, to scratch, to protect itself in the only way it knew how. They spoke in low voices, moved deliberately, kept their energy calm and their actions slow. But the bobcat didn't react, not when they knelt beside her, not when they eased a soft stretcher beneath her body, not even when they lifted her and began carrying her toward the transport vehicle. She lay in their arms like something that had already made its peace. It was that stillness, that unnatural, almost accepting stillness, that unsettled the team more than any aggression would have. At the wildlife veterinary clinic, the arrival was met with the quiet urgency that experienced staff have learned over years. No shouting, no rushing, just a coordinated, focused response that begins the moment the transport doors open. The lead vet, Dr. Mara Hensley, had been working with wild and exotic animals for nearly 2 decades. She had treated bobcats before, had seen animals come in far worse, on paper, and had watched them fight their way back. She believed in that fight. She looked for it in every animal that came through her door. She looked for it in this one too. What she found gave her pause. The bobcat was placed on the examination table under bright, clinical light, and the full picture of her condition came into focus. Severe dehydration, dangerously low body temperature, labored, irregular breathing that caught and stumbled between intervals. There were signs of what appeared to be trauma, not fresh wounds, but the kind of internal wearing down that comes from days, possibly longer, without adequate food or water, perhaps exposure, perhaps illness, perhaps both. It was too early to know everything, but it was not too early to understand that this animal had been struggling for a long time before anyone found her. Dr. Hensley issued quiet instructions and her team moved in, practiced rhythm around her, drawing blood, administering initial fluids through a carefully placed IV line, monitoring vitals, recording everything. The clinic had the tools, they had the training, they had seen animals pulled back from the edge before, and they would do everything within their power to do it again. But there was something else in the room that evening, something harder to measure than blood pressure or body temperature. It was the way the bobcat lay there. Wild animals, even gravely ill ones, carry a baseline of tension in their bodies, an instinctive weariness of human proximity that never fully leaves them. Even in sedation, even in the deepest shock, there is usually something held back, a tightness in the jaw, a curl in the paw, some last preserved signal from the part of the brain that says, "You are not safe here." This bobcat had none of that. She lay completely open, completely still. Her legs were not tucked beneath her in the protective crouch of a guarded animal. They were loose, extended, almost relaxed. Her breathing, ragged as it was, carried no tension in the chest, and her eyes, those half-open amber eyes that tracked nothing and no one, somehow gave the impression not of vacancy, but of something else entirely, something harder to name. One of the younger technicians, barely 2 years out of school, looked up from the monitoring equipment and said quietly to no one in particular, "It's like she knows." No one responded. but no one disagreed either. Dr. Hensley worked through the evening without stopping. The fluids went in, the warming protocol began. Medications were administered and documented. Every number, every reading, every small response from the animal's body was watched and recorded with the discipline of people who understand that in cases like this, everything matters and nothing can be assumed. But by nightfall, the numbers had not improved the way they needed to. They had stabilized, but only barely. And stabilized was not the same as turning. The bobcat's body was still fighting something that fluids and warmth and medication alone might not be enough to overcome. Dr. Hensley stood at the edge of the table in the low light of the clinic and looked at the animal in front of her. She had one option left, and it was not a certain one. The night stretched long inside the clinic. Most of the staff had rotated through in shifts, checking vitals, adjusting the warming blankets, recording every small fluctuation in the bobcat's numbers. The work was quiet and methodical, the way it always is when there is nothing left to do but wait and watch and refuse to stop trying. Someone had left a cup of coffee on the corner desk that no one ever touched. The overhead lights had been dimmed to give the animal some peace, and through all of it the bobcat lay still, breathing, but barely gaining ground. Dr. Hensley had gone home for a few hours just before midnight. She had learned over the years that exhausted hands make mistakes, and that the animals in her care deserved better than that. But she had not slept, not really. She was back before 5 in the morning, standing at the table again with fresh eyes and the same quiet weight in her chest that had followed her home. The morning blood work confirmed what she had feared. The bobcat's organ function was under serious stress. The fluids had helped, had bought time, but the underlying condition was deeper than dehydration alone. Her body was struggling to regulate itself, and the longer it stayed in that state, the less reserve it would have to draw from. The window for meaningful intervention was narrowing. Everyone in the room understood that without it being said. Dr. Hensley reviewed the options with her senior technician in low, measured tones. There was one remaining course of action. A high-concentration injection designed to stimulate the system, to essentially force the body into a stronger response. It was not a gentle intervention. In a weakened animal, it carried real risk. The same properties that might shock the system back into function could, just as easily, overwhelm a body that had nothing left to give. There was no clean answer. There never was in moments like this. She made the call. The syringe was prepared in silence. The team repositioned themselves around the table. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with the particular attentiveness of people who understand they are standing at the edge of something. Dr. Hensley drew a slow breath, steadied herself, and stepped forward. The bobcat lay motionless beneath the light, eyes half open, paws loose, chest rising and falling in that shallow, uncertain rhythm that had defined the last 18 hours. The needle moved closer, and that was when it happened. The paw moved first. Not a spasm, not an involuntary tremor from a body shutting down. It was deliberate, slow and deliberate, the way a gesture is when it carries intention behind it. The bobcat's left forepaw lifted just slightly from the surface of the table, and then, with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the wildness of the creature it came from, it came to rest against Dr. Hensley's forearm. Just rested there, quiet and still. Dr. Hensley stopped breathing. The syringe stayed exactly where it was, suspended in the space between action and pause, as her mind tried to process what her body had already understood. She had worked with wild animals for 19 years. She knew their behaviors, their fear responses, their instincts under duress. She knew what it looked like when an animal fought. She knew what it looked like when one surrendered. This was neither of those things. This was something she had no clinical category for. The room had gone completely silent. No one shifted. No one spoke. The monitoring equipment continued its soft, rhythmic reading of the bobcat's vitals, indifferent to the extraordinary stillness that had settled over everything else. One of the technicians standing at the far end of the table had raised a hand slowly to her mouth without realizing she'd done it. Dr. Hensley looked down at the paw resting against her arm, small, compared to what most people imagined when they thought of a bobcat. The pads were rough and dry from days of exposure. The claws were fully sheathed, relaxed, unthreatening, almost tender in the way they made contact with her skin. She had seen animals accept treatment before, had seen them exhaust themselves past resistance and go limp in her hands. But this was not exhaustion. This was not the absence of fight. It was the presence of something else entirely. Her throat tightened before she could stop it. The professional distance she had spent 2 decades learning to maintain, the necessary, careful separation between her care and her emotion, simply dissolved. Not with drama, not with a sound, just quietly, completely, the way a wall comes down when the right thing touches it at exactly the right moment. A single tear moved down her face. She didn't wipe it away. She looked at the bobcat, at those half-open amber eyes that seemed for just a moment to be looking back at her, and she understood something she could not have put into words then and perhaps still cannot fully explain. The animal was not giving up. It was trusting her, and that changed everything about what happened next. She completed the injection, slowly, carefully, with every measure of steadiness she could gather back into her hands after what had just passed between them. The needle found its mark, the medication entered, and Dr. Hensley withdrew with the same deliberate gentleness she had carried into every moment of the last 24 hours. The bobcat's paw remained against her arm through all of it, still resting, still soft. Then she waited. The room waited with her. Those first seconds after an intervention like that are among the longest a veterinarian ever experiences. The mind runs every possible outcome simultaneously, the hopeful ones and the ones that break you, while the hands stay calm and the face stays composed because the people around you are watching, and steady leadership is its own form of care. Dr. Hensley had stood in this exact kind of silence before, had felt this specific quality of dread and hope existing in the same breath. But she had never stood here with a wild animal's paw resting against her skin. 10 seconds passed, then 20, nothing changed. And then, a breath, deeper than the ones that had come before it, fuller, as if something that had been locked tight inside the bobcat's chest had finally, cautiously begun to release. The monitoring equipment caught it a moment later, a small but unmistakable shift in the numbers, heart rate steadying, oxygen levels beginning slowly to climb. Then another breath, and another. The senior technician exhaled audibly from across the table. Someone behind Dr. Hensley took a single step backward, as if they needed physical distance from the intensity of the moment. Another staff member pressed both hands flat against the counter and stared at the monitors with the focused disbelief of someone watching something they will spend years trying to describe accurately to people who weren't there. Dr. Hensley did not move. She stayed exactly where she was, beside the table, beside the bobcat, one hand still close enough that the animal's paw had not yet lost contact with her arm. She watched the numbers climb with the careful, measured hope of someone who has been surprised by loss often enough to never celebrate too soon, but she felt it rising in her chest regardless, quiet and warm and very, very real. The bobcat's eyes, those half-open amber eyes, drifted closed at last. Not in the way that had frightened them all through the long hours of the night before. In the other way, the peaceful way, the way that meant rest. Dr. Hensley finally allowed herself to breathe. She looked around the room, at her team, at the monitors, at the small wild creature lying under the warm clinic light, and she felt something settle inside her that she hadn't realized had been untethered. In 19 years she had saved many animals, but this one, in the quiet of that room, had given something back.